Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aline McNall, and this is this week's Washington Update. As a quick note, this Washington Update has been pre-recorded because I'm actually at an international conference. And so I will actually be presenting a little bit of what I'm talking about in the international conference in hopes that we can spark a debate within IEEE on a couple of these different policy areas. So a little overview of remote sensing policy. It's a topic that IEEE is beginning to explore as we build up our space policy portfolio. Space Policy Directive 2 in the Trump administration was an effort for that administration to reform the commercial space regulatory framework, and they successfully did that by streamlining a lot of the regulations that the commercial space sector had been needing to comply with, and in general that became overly burdensome, so the Trump administration took a hard look at the regulations that the commercial space sector needed to comply with and then tried to streamline that. What they did was they directed the Department of Transportation to release a regulatory system for launch and reentry as a single license. And so the commercial space entities would not have to go through multiple licensing types. The Secretary of Commerce was also directed to develop a plan to create a one-stop shop within the Department of Commerce for administering and regulating commercial spaceflight activities. And lastly, it directed the National Space Council to review export licensing and regulations affecting the commercial spaceflight activity. For those of you who are involved in our R&D policy committee, these export licensing issues is something that we're looking at in terms of overall federal export control policy. And so I look forward to working with that committee, but also with our space group to look at the export control kind of issues as a subset of remote sensing issues. So in terms of current issues, because of the streamlined regulations did help the commercial space sector, there's not a lot of legislative push at the moment for remote sensing legislation, except for there is one House bill, HR 290, which is the Commercial Remote Sensing Amendment Act. And it did pass the House, but there's currently no Senate companion. What it does is it modifies provisions relating to the licensing of private remote sensing systems. It reduces the amount of time that NOAA has to review and make determinations on applications for the licenses to operate private remote sensing space systems. It also expands the annual reporting on private remote sensing systems as well. So this is kind of the last step in terms of looking at private remote sensing regulation and issues there. Currently, the Biden administration has out their space policy framework, which does include provisions directing the U.S. to maintain a robust and responsible U.S. space enterprise and to use space as a source of American innovation and opportunity. So whereas the framework doesn't specifically mention remote sensing, there are certainly provisions in the framework that are supportive of U.S. remote sensing, the government side of it, as well as the commercial space sector in this area. A little bit of history about remote sensing policy. In the 90s was the first iteration of the commercial space remote sensing policy kind of legislation that we saw coming through Congress. And since then, of course, the commercial space sector has drastically expanded. So remote sensing legislation has become a useful tool to help that industry expand. And NASA certainly drives American innovation in this sector to power job creation and offer tools to manage our society. NASA is actively looking to partner with the commercial space companies to expand the scientific user community, particularly in remote sensing, to grow economic sectors ranging from agriculture and crop issues to climate issues to disaster recovery and mitigation efforts, to other issues that affect our society. So obviously remote sensing data can be used in many of these different areas of our economy. And NASA is, of course, looking to partner with many different commercial companies in order to solve these global challenges. Earth observation is, of course, an international endeavor taken on by JAXA, the Europeans, and the Canadians, as well as many other space entities throughout the world. So I did want to highlight a little bit of what Canada is up to. Canada did recently release an Earth observation strategy that includes ensuring that satellites used for Earth observation have data that is free and accessible to maximize science and innovation and economic development, that they are harnessing satellite Earth observation information to address climate change and other issues, strengthening the delivery of critical services, particularly for many different sectors of the economy, and then inspiring skills and capacity to develop for the next generation. So a lot of these are issues that the US and NASA has certainly put forward in terms of our own Earth observation strategy. But we look forward to certainly working with Canada and other nations as well who share these interests. JAXA and the Europeans also, of course, share the same interests in terms of improving the data collection and free accessible, and the fact that data should be free and accessible to the maximum extent possible, as well as delivering critical services to their economic sectors and to the global economy as well. So I mentioned that Earth observation is, of course, an international endeavor. Some of the areas where the U.S. and other developed space nations can certainly partner with the developing nations of the world does include this area of remote sensing. So in our current development strategy and policy right now, we look at topical issues ranging from agriculture and climate mitigation to defense and energy issues. The words remote sensing aren't necessarily always at the forefront of these discussions, but remote sensing, obviously, the data does play into each of these different areas. So in terms of remote sensing policy from a U.S. foreign policy or an international perspective, the data shared between developing nations and developed countries is starting to be a part of the sustainable economic development discussions throughout the UN and other international bodies. Another issue to consider is the global observing strategy. So you have many different nations taking images of the same spots on Earth. And so one of the things that IEEE is looking into in terms from a defense perspective is this idea of geoassurance, or having multiple images of the same location, which then allows governments to know who is following international law and what is happening from if the Europeans and the United States and JAXA are all showing one thing, are each of the governments that are imaging a certain area showing the same thing, or are there discrepancies? And so this becomes an area of international law, but also of national defense and certainly security issues for the nations that are certainly involved in remote sensing imaging of these particular areas. Commercial systems are, of course, important to civil and military applications. And so how does the commercial space sector deal with this versus the US government? And just as a quick technical note, by having pixel level assurance, many entities are able to take images of the same location. So the US government can then monitor activities around the globe with the assurance that the images are in fact correct. So we're looking at just information transparency as an issue relating to kind of the images that we're seeing coming out of the satellites. Another issue as it relates to remote sensing policy that IEEE members might be interested in kind of engaging in includes the data management, processing, and interpretation, as well as analysis side of things. So the IT sector is also driving remote sensing policy forward. Developed countries have, of course, made remote sensing data not only open and available to the research, but the global community. And so researchers around the world are able to then take data and manage these huge data sets. That very much gets into IT policy as well as space policy, of course, because the large amounts of data are used to create tools, both for developing domestic economic markets, but also to help in the international community space. Weather monitoring, agriculture, energy resource issues, all of these tools are being developed because of this huge amount of data. And so how is the IT community coming forward and helping with managing that data, with the servers that the data is stored on, to how the US is looking in terms of the whole of government approach to data buys. Commercial satellites can also deliver imagery for the government to then make management decisions. But in terms of data gaps, they do exist. And so IEEE is, of course, looking at some of these in terms of just data gap infrastructure and how does that affect global decision making? What public-private partnerships can help fill these data gaps? And where do opportunities exist to quantify and track and mitigate, for example, emissions? Some of the remote sensing data is used to look at like methane emissions, which are not necessarily visible to companies or industry, but are visible from space from these images. And so how can we then use that data to then mitigate the emission issue? That's just one example of remote sensing data, and then figuring out what gaps exist and how we can help the different economic sectors in the country. Another thing to consider with respect to remote sensing data and information is the export control issue. As I mentioned, our R&D policy committee is focused on reviewing export control policy throughout the federal government. Remote sensing instrumentation, as well as the data tools developed using that remote sensing information, is of course subject to U.S. export control law. So from an IEEE policy perspective, of course, we're looking at export control policy throughout the federal government. But what does that do when it's a data tool versus actual data sets versus actual instrumentation? And so those discussions are, of course, ongoing with the federal government, and we look forward to looking at the policy to make sure that it's streamlined as much as possible. One other issue, of course, is AI and the implications that AI has on remote sensing data. So artificial intelligence can be used to improve analysis of these large areas of interest. It can be used to classify objects as well as study land use. AI is also used to combine large data sets to perform spectral analysis and environmental change kind of calculations. For the GIS community of IEEE members, AI GIS combines artificial intelligence with GIS operations, including spatial data processing and algorithm development. So AI is certainly one of those topics where the community can come together with the space community to form adequate policies to make sure that the data management is certainly done in accordance with ethical AI principles and other AI considerations. AI can also be, of course, used when disruptions such as cloud cover render an image useless. And so in terms of ensuring that AI can really help with the imagery and help with the federal government's analysis of the images, we certainly look forward to working with NASA and with other agencies on that issue. So ends my talk. I have included my email in this presentation so that any of you who are interested in perhaps engaging on some of these topics can certainly reach out. And the next update will be June 8th, and that will be a live update. And so feel free to ask questions about legislation at that update. I wanted to kind of give a topical overview for a deeper dive into one of these topics that we can look at from an IEEE government relations perspective, but also touches on so many different communities within the IEEE technical space. So I would love to engage with any of you who are interested in remote sensing policy, but also the AI implications of it, the IT community implications, those of you who do data management. Please feel free to reach out if you're interested in kind of engaging in some of these policy discussions that we're having with NASA and with the Department of Defense and other agencies within the federal government. Thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting with you all on June 8th.